I said, Pastor, are your people ready for this? He got indignant and backed up and got a stiff. He said, of course they are. He said, I've trained them for this very hour. And that morning at 3:00, the alarm bell went off to say the British were coming. The alarm bell was the bell in his church. He's ringing to say, guys, you need to gather. Here come the British. It turned out they didn't come on the first alarm. They came at sunrise on the second alarm. And that alarm is when you have the shot heard around the world. You have 54 Americans taking on 700 British soldiers. Pretty lopsided fight. And it turned out that way. At the end of that fight, at the 54 Americans, 19 were laying on the ground in Lexington Green. And the 19 laying on the ground included white patriots like John Robbins, black patriots like Prince Estabrook, black and white going to church together because all 54 guys were out of the same church. They all went to church. Pastor Clark was their pastor. It was the church who stepped out there to defend the town from the enemy that was coming. Well, the British went on through Lexington. They get to Concord. What happened to Concord Bridge? Instead of fighting 54 Americans, they found 400 Americans. And that wasn't near as good odds. Several British were shot at that point. They said, we better get back to Boston. This thing is growing, and it's growing faster than we are. So they got 19 miles to march back to Boston. As they marched back to Boston along the road, it really got tough for them. Closer they got to Boston, instead of fighting 54 Americans or 400 Americans, they have 4,000 to 5,000 Americans lining the road on both sides, shooting at them from both sides. So it's like running a lead gauntlet to get back. And it's interesting. You remember Wentworth Cheswell rode north? Well, he's telling all these guys up north, hey, here's what happened. The British have attacked. And so all these guys from the north came south down to the road to wait for the British. And it's interesting to see who these guys were along the road. You had, for example, the Reverend William Payson, who led a group of his men from his church to attack the British as they retreated to Boston. You had the Reverend Jonathan French. I love this. He was in the pulpit when he got the word. He left from his pulpit to go to Boston, a musket in one hand and a surgical bag in the other. I don't know, maybe you shoot them and then fix them. I don't know how that works, but he's got musket. But see, it was preachers leading the churches out to take on the danger that was facing their community. 6 weeks after that, you had the Battle of Bunker Hill. The hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill is Black Patriot Peter Salem right there. 12 military commendations that day presented to the commander-in-chief. They built monuments to him, standing right beside Thomas Grosvenor. Again, that image of black and white. But as word got out across the country that we now had a full-fledged battle going in Bunker Hill, it's amazing to see who came running. For example, up in Vermont, Reverend David Avery took 20 guys out of his church to come. Now, he didn't get there in time for the battle, but he heard they're there, and we got to go defend our brethren. And, there were 3 million people in America back then. So, granted, a mega church back then would be a few hundred. So, 20 people, but that's Vermont. That's probably a mega church in Vermont back then was 20 people. And given the spiritual condition of Vermont today, it's probably still a mega church in Vermont. So, in New Hampshire, you had Reverend Stephen Farrar grabbed 97 guys out of his church and headed for Bunker Hill. You have Reverend Joseph Willard, who grabbed 2 full companies out of his church, went across town. He didn't make it there in time for the battle. Down in Pennsylvania, you had John Steele, who grabbed 900 men out of his, that's a mega church, 900 men out of his church. And then down in Pennsylvania, you have examples of Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg with 300 of his men. And this is why, looking back over the history, that's why Bishop Galloway said mighty men they were, men of iron nerve and strong hand and unblenched cheek and heart aflame. And even if I just take Muhlenberg for just a second, Muhlenberg literally wore under his black robe, he wore his military uniform. I mean, he is a preacher, but he is also a soldier. He's an officer. He led 300 men out. He became one of Washington's top-ranked generals. This is the painting inside the rotunda of the Capitol. That is the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg right there, who is also Major General John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Joseph Story is one of the most important names in American jurisprudence. Not only was he placed on the U.S. Supreme Court by President James Madison, but he also founded Harvard Law School and authored numerous legal works on the Constitution. While today's revisionists claim that the goal of the First Amendment was absolute religious pluralism, Justice Joseph Story vehemently disagreed. He declared, "The real object of the First Amendment was not to encourage, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but was to exclude all rivalry among Christian denominations." According to founder Joseph Story, Christianity, not pluralism, was the goal of the Founding Fathers in the First Amendment, for only a Christian nation is tolerant and thus is truly pluralistic.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact Wall Builders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
If you ever go to Valley Forge, you'll get to see the Muhlenberg Barracks. Why? Because that's the guys from his church, and that's their pastor who built those barracks to spend those 6 months there at that tough winter at Valley Forge. Now, he had a brother who was also a pastor. His brother is Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, and Frederick Augustus has an interesting signature, and it's seen right on the bottom of the Bill of Rights. Now, why would it be there? Because he's a Speaker of the House of Representatives. A preacher? The first ever Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives is a preacher, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. And by the way, his brother came back to Congress. It was in the first Congress. Peter also helped frame the Bill of Rights. And they signed off on a First Amendment, not because it guaranteed separation of church and state, because it doesn't say that. It guarantees the free exercise of religion, and that's what they were fighting for, and that's what they wanted, and that's why you find signatures of preachers on documents like that. Not just on documents like that. You take the Declaration, you take the 56 guys who did the Declaration. We don't get told today, but 29 of these guys had seminary and Bible school degrees. And they say that the single work they used most to write that document was this one. Matter of fact, Richard Henry Lee over there, who made the motion we separate from Great Britain, he's the guy who said that we copied the Declaration out of Locke's 2 treatises of government. Now, up until 50 years ago, if you went to any government class in America, you would have read Locke's 2 treatises of government, because we all knew, Ben Franklin and John Witherspoon and Francis Hopkinson and Benjamin Rush and John Adams, all these guys talked about how Locke is what shaped their thinking on the Declaration. So we read that, because if you're going to know what government comes from, you got to know where the ideas came from. So we always, and it's not a long book. It's less than an inch thick, less than 400 pages long, but we don't read it anymore today. How come? Because in that little book, it cites the Bible over 1,500 times to show the proper operation of civil government. We're supposed to be a secular country. We can't be reading books like that and see where we got our ideas from. 1,500 Bible verses on how government's to operate. And then after that, as we get into the Constitutional Convention 11 years later, you may recall that it didn't start well. After 5 weeks, they were breaking up. Hamilton took the New York delegation. They're going home, and George Mason's heading back to Virginia. Things just falling apart. And it was at that point Franklin called for prayer. And when he did, George Washington wrote an interesting thing in his diary. George Washington said that weekend they recessed and went to church 3 days. Took a 3-day recess, went to church. They specifically went to the church of the Reverend William Rogers, a church there in Philadelphia. And William Rogers had a whole Constitutional Convention right there in church with him, and he prayed a special prayer over the convention. I have the actual prayer he prayed. Significantly, that prayer was so important that it was printed on the front page of the Philadelphia newspaper so that everybody in the city would know what had been prayed over the Constitutional Convention. And it's not a dinky little prayer. The front page of the newspaper, that prayer takes 80% of the front page of that newspaper. That is no small prayer that he prayed. Here's part of what appeared. He says, "As this is a period, O Lord, big with events and penetrable by any human scrutiny, we fervently recommend that thy fatherly notice that august body assembled in this city who compose our federal convention. Will it please thee, O thou eternal I am, to favor them from day to day with thy immediate presence? Be thou their wisdom and their strength. Enable them to devise such measures as may prove happily instrumental for healing all divisions." See, everybody knew they were fighting. It was real clear they were all going home. He says, healing all divisions, and for promoting the good of the great whole. And he just keeps praying and praying and praying and praying. And when they got back together after that, delegates like Jonathan Dayton said the whole atmosphere was changed. For the first time, they weren't fighting with each other. They said, that's not a bad idea. Let's try that. And so they started making some progress. And as a result, only 10 weeks later, they came up with a document that we now enjoy today. And it's amazing how many specific clauses out of the Constitution are direct wording out of Bible verses. Now, most people have no clue that because they think the Constitution is a secular document, and most of them never read the Bible anyway, so how would they know? But if you know both documents, you'll see Bible verses all throughout. Now, once we get that Constitution done, it has to be ratified. So we have to have ratification conventions. And ratification convention, if you got a government document to ratify, where are you going to send it? State capital, all 13 states, right? Yeah, maybe. But it's not the way it worked. Interestingly, the ratification conventions, states like North Carolina, states like Massachusetts, they held the ratification conventions not at the state capitol, they held it in churches. Literally, the ratification convention for the Constitution was held in churches, and each state had to elect official delegates to ratify the Constitution. 44 of the official delegates to ratify the Constitution were ministers of the gospel. There's just no way the church was sitting on the sideline throughout this time. And again, that's why the British blamed the preachers, and that's why the Americans said it was the preachers. Everybody agreed. They were there. And then when we got the Constitution all ratified, we need to celebrate it, so we have a big ratification parade. Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration, who lived in Philadelphia, watched the parade, and he was elated to see who all was in the parade. As he explained, the clergy formed a very agreeable part of the procession. They manifested by their attendance their sense of the connection between religion and good government. He said, I was so glad to see them there because that shows they understand you can't have good government if you don't have man, what's happened? I mean, we look at what we enjoy. We celebrated 235 years, but guess what, guys? If it wasn't for the church and church leaders, we wouldn't have much to celebrate today. That's where it came from. And that's what's so cool, what ADF's got going on the Pulpit Initiative and Speak Up movement. I want to close this segment for pastors before I move into some of the constitutional and legal and other things by this quote from Charles Finney. Charles Finney was the preacher in the Second Great Awakening, the best-known preacher in that great revival. And this is what Finney said to the preachers in his generation. I don't think anything's changed. He grew up to the founding generation. He talking to the guys in the second generation now and third generation, these preachers. He says, gentlemen, he says, our preaching will bear its legitimate fruits. He says, if immorality prevails in the land, the fault's ours in a great degree. He says, if there's a decay of conscience, the pulpit's responsible for it. He says, if the public press lacks moral discrimination, the pulpit is responsible. Wait a minute, how's the pulpit responsible for public press? It's real easy. People used to get their news from the church. Therefore, when the secular guys came out and tried to do something stupid, nobody bought their papers because we already got the right view of the news. So free market put them out of business. Do you know how much that drove the newspaper business? Do you know the longest telegraph ever sent in the history of the world was 117,000 words. It's a long telegraph. It was sent in 1917. You know why? Because 1917 is when the revised version of the Bible arrived from England to America.